You want to know what's wrong with me? Ethan's voice broke like dry wood in winter, his knuckles white against the porch railing. Nobody ever stayed. Not one person in 35 years ever looked at me and decided I was worth staying for. He turned away before she could see his face. That's not something a man gets over, Clara. That's something he becomes. She didn't reach for him. She didn't offer him pity or soft words. She just said quietly, and without flinching, "Then let me be the first one who stays." If this is your first time here, subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. The first thing people noticed about Ethan Callahan was not his size, though he was a large man. It was not the worn revolver on his hip, though every eye in Silver Creek dropped to it the moment he walked through a door. It was his silence. Not the comfortable silence of a man at peace with himself, but the particular, pressurized quiet of someone who had learned a long time ago that speaking only led to pain. He wore that silence the way other men wore hats constantly, deliberately, as though removing it might expose something raw and unfinished underneath. He rode into Silver Creek on a Tuesday morning, in the deep summer of 1882, with nothing but a bedroll, a horse named Duke who was as bad-tempered as his rider, and a reputation that had drifted ahead of him, like smoke. He was 35 years old. He looked 50. Not in the way of sickness, but in the way of a man who had spent every one of those years earning his keep in places that took more than they gave. The town was small. That was the first thing he registered. Small towns had long memories and short tolerance for men who looked the way. He looked like trouble wearing a human face. He had learned to read a town in the first 30 seconds, had learned to calculate its welcome or its hostility before he'd even dismounted, and Silver Creek told him, in the tilt of heads and the narrowing of eyes along the main street, that it had already made a decision about him, without the inconvenience of knowing a single fact. He didn't blame them. He had given them no reason to think differently. He tied Duke outside the only saloon that showed signs of still being open, pushed through the door, and found himself in the particular quality of midday darkness that every frontier saloon shared, the smell of stales and sawdust decisions, the low murmur of men who had nowhere better to be. He crossed to the bar without looking at anyone, dropped a coin on the worn wood, and said 2 words: "Whiskey, Job." The bartender, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had survived this business by knowing when to push and when to leave well enough alone, looked him over with professional speed. "Callahan," he said. Ethan didn't show any reaction. He had learned not to. "Word travels fast," he said. "Word travels fast when a man's got a history like yours." The bartender poured the whiskey anyway. "There's a ranch east of here. Harlan Briggs owns it. Lost 3 hands this month, and he's getting desperate enough to overlook certain things." "What kind of certain things?" The bartender met his eyes for exactly 1 second. "The kind that follow a man into a new town." Ethan picked up the glass. Set it down without drinking. That was a habit he'd developed, pouring whiskey when he needed a moment to think, and then not drinking it, because he had watched other men lose themselves in exactly this kind of glass. And he had decided somewhere along the way that he would not become what his father had become. He had kept that promise to himself, mostly. There were years he didn't like to examine too closely. "I'll find Briggs," he said. He left the coin, left the whiskey, and walked back out into the blinding Wyoming sun. The Briggs Ranch was 4 miles east of town, and he heard it before he saw it: the sound of horses, the clang of equipment, the particular organized noise of a working operation trying to hold itself together under pressure. Harlan Briggs himself came out to meet him at the gate, which told Ethan something immediately. Men who were genuinely desperate came to meet you. Men who had options made you wait. Briggs was 60, maybe older, with a rancher's hands and a preacher's eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen enough of life to stop being surprised by it. "You're Callahan, I am. Heard you're the best with difficult horses. I've broken most of the difficult ones in Wyoming. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. And the rest? The rest broke me first. He said it without expression, and something in the flatness of it made Briggs blink. But I'm still here. There was a pause that stretched between them, like something that needed to be tested before being trusted. I'll pay fair wages, Briggs said finally. I'll ask fair work. I won't ask questions about things that aren't my business. What I will tell you is that this is a ranch where people are treated decent. I expect the same from every man who draws pay here. He paused. Think you can manage that? Decent, Ethan repeated, like it was a word in a foreign language he was translating slowly. That's the whole of it. Ethan looked past him at the ranch. He looked at the hands moving around the property. He looked at the horses in the far paddock, the difficult ones, the ones nobody else wanted to deal with. He understood those horses. He understood them probably better than he had ever understood a person. I can manage that, he said. He started the next morning. The other hands were cautious around him at first, which was the right instinct. He was not an easy man to be around. He didn't make conversation. He didn't join them at the bunkhouse table for the evening card games. He did his work with a mechanical precision that left no room for complaint but also offered nothing extra, nothing warm, nothing personal, nothing that might be mistaken for friendship. They left him alone. He preferred it that way. But within a week, even the most skeptical of them had to admit that Ethan Callahan could do things with a horse that shouldn't have been possible. He had a particular gift for reading an animal's fear, the way a horse shifted its weight, the angle of its ears, the specific tension that came before a kick or a bolt, and rather than fighting it, he worked with it. He moved slowly. He was patient in a way that no one who watched him with people would have expected. He never lost his temper with the animals, never raised his voice, never forced what could be earned. One of the younger hands, a 19-year-old named Tommy, who had the unfortunate habit of asking questions that nobody wanted to answer, watched him work one afternoon with an animal that had thrown 3 men before breakfast. "How do you do it?" Tommy asked, leaning on the fence. "The horse, I mean. How do you get it to trust you?" Ethan didn't look up from the rope in his hands. "I don't ask it to trust me." Tommy waited. "Then what do you do?" "I let it decide." He moved slowly toward the horse. "You can't force trust. You earn it. You show up the same way every time, and eventually the animal figures out you're not going to hurt it." He paused. Most of the time, Tommy was quiet for a moment. "What about people?" Ethan's hands stilled on the rope. He turned and looked at Tommy with the kind of expression that made the boy take a step back without knowing why. "People are harder," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. It was in the second week that he first became aware of the farm to the north. He wouldn't have paid attention to it at all if Duke hadn't thrown a shoe half a mile up the track one evening after a long day, forcing him to walk the horse back toward the ranch by a different route that took him past a property that looked like it was in a quiet argument with itself about whether to survive or surrender. The farmhouse was small but solid. The fence lines needed work. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told him the person who lived here understood priorities: animals first, comfort second, appearances not at all. There was a kitchen garden to one side that showed real care, the kind of careful that meant someone believed in the future enough to plant things that took time to grow. He would have kept walking. He had no reason to stop. And then he heard the sound, not distress exactly, not a scream or a cry for help, but the particular sound of someone fighting a problem alone, the grunt of physical effort, the mutter of frustration that wasn't quite words, the specific quality of struggle that comes from doing something that requires 2 people with only one. He stopped. Duke stopped with him, ear flicking toward the sound. Around the side of the farmhouse, partially hidden by the fence line, a woman was attempting to repair a wagon wheel that had clearly come off its axle. She was not small, and she was clearly not helpless, but the wheel itself was heavy, and the axle was at the wrong angle, and she was losing ground to physics in a way that was only going to end one way. She had not seen him. He stood at the fence line for a full 30 seconds, watching, asking himself what he was doing and why he hadn't already walked on. He was good at walking on. He had been doing it his whole life. The wheel shifted. She caught it barely, and the sound she made was the kind of sound that costs a person something to make, the sound of pride, surrendering to necessity. He opened the gate and walked through before he had decided to. She heard his footsteps and spun around. Her first response was to position herself between him and the wagon, not in a panicked way, but in an assessing way. The way of someone who had learned to evaluate situations before reacting to them. Her eyes went to his size first, then to his hands. Then to his face. "I don't need help," she said. It was not true. They both knew it, but he understood why she said it. "Wheel needs 2 people," he said. "I'm here. I can be one of them." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're the new hand at the Briggs Ranch." Word travels. It does in a town like this. She hadn't moved from her position. "You've got a reputation. Most of it earned." Something shifted in her expression. He couldn't read it exactly. He had never been good at reading people the way he was good at reading horses. But it wasn't fear which surprised him. Most women looked at him with some degree of fear, or at least wariness. She looked at him with something more like curiosity. "Clara Whitmore," she said, and she didn't extend her hand because she was still holding the wheel. "This is my farm, Ethan Callahan." He moved toward the wagon without waiting for permission. "Hold that steady." She did. He got the axle angle correct, positioned himself under the wheel, and between the two of them, they got it seated. The whole thing took 4 minutes. He checked the mounting, tested the stability, and stepped back. She was watching him with that same look, the curious one. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was apparently the kind of person who said exactly what she was thinking, "You stopped." Most men don't stop. He had no answer for that, because the honest answer was that he didn't know why he had stopped either. So he said nothing, which was his default response to things he didn't understand. "I can pay you," she said. "Wasn't looking for payment." "Then let me feed you. I've got supper enough for 2. She said it plainly, without invitation in her voice, more in the tone of someone settling an account. "You helped me. That's how it works." He should have refused. He always refused. He had a policy of refusing everything that looked like kindness, because he had learned early that kindness came with expectations you couldn't always meet, and when you failed to meet them, you paid a price that had nothing to do with the original transaction. But his stomach spoke before his caution could, and she had already turned toward the farmhouse, and Duke needed rest, and he told himself it was only a meal. He told himself it was only a meal. The inside of the farmhouse told the same story as the outside, practical, careful, no waste, no apology for what wasn't there. A single table, mismatched chairs, a cast-iron stove that was doing the work of a hearth. The kitchen garden had produced well this summer. He could see it in the food she put together quickly, and without apparent effort: beans, corn, preserved tomatoes from the cellar, cornbread that had been made that morning. She set 2 places and sat down across from him without ceremony. He was conscious, in a way that made him uncomfortable, that he couldn't remember the last time someone had set a place for him at a table. They ate in silence for a while, which suited him, but it was a different kind of silence than he was used to, not the aggressive silence of a standoff or the hollow silence of solitude, but the easier silence of 2 people who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with noise. She broke it first. "How long have you been riding?" "Since I was old enough to stay on." "Where are you from?" He looked up from his plate. Most people backed down when he looked at them directly. She didn't. "Nowhere that matters," he said. She considered this. Everyone's from somewhere that matters. It just doesn't always feel that way from the inside. He didn't have a response to that. He went back to eating. "My family were settlers," she said, not asking him to reciprocate, just filling the space with something. "Came out here from Ohio when I was 12. My father believed in this land the way some people believe in scripture." A pause. He was right to. He just didn't live long enough to see it. He heard the weight in that sentence and recognized it, the way you recognized a familiar landmark in unfamiliar country. The weight of loss that had been carried when it had stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like just another part of the person. He knew that weight. "I'm sorry," he said, which surprised both of them, because it was not a phrase that came easily to him. She looked at him with that curious expression again. "You say that like you mean it." "I do mean it. Most people don't." She said it without bitterness, as simple observation. "They say it because it's what you say. You said it because you understand it." She tilted her head. "Who did you lose?" The question was so direct that for a moment he simply stared at her. Nobody asked him direct questions. They skirted around the edges of his history, the way you skirted around a fire aware of the heat, not willing to get close enough to feel it. "My mother," he said finally, "when I was 8. She nodded, and she didn't follow it with the condolences or the questions that usually came next. She just accepted it the way you accepted weather, as a fact of the world that didn't require commentary. He found himself speaking again before he meant to. "My father was still alive. That was the problem." Something in her went still. Not with shock, but with attention, the kind of full attention you gave something that mattered. He looked down at his plate. He had said too much. He always knew exactly when he had said too much, and he had an established method of backing away from it, a practiced retreat into silence that he executed now. But she didn't try to pull him back. She let him retreat. She didn't follow him into the silence with more questions, or reach in with the verbal equivalent of bingo. She just let him be where he was, which was, he realized, with a slow, strange discomfort that had nothing to do with threat, almost unbearably kind. He finished his supper. He thanked her, another phrase that came out more awkwardly than he intended, rusty from disuse. He collected Duke and walked back toward the Briggs Ranch in the long evening light, and he did not think about Clara Whitmore, or at least he told himself he didn't, which was a different thing entirely. The next morning, he found himself riding the fence line that bordered her property. He told himself it was a reasonable route. It was not a reasonable route. He saw her in the kitchen garden, working. She looked up when Duke's hoofbeats reached her. She didn't wave, didn't call out, but she didn't look away either. They acknowledged each other across the distance, the way people acknowledge a fact they haven't yet decided what to do with. He kept riding. 2 days later, one of the Briggs hands mentioned at supper that the widow Whitmore's north pasture fence had come down in the wind, and her cattle were going to be somebody's problem if nobody fixed it. Ethan was on his feet before he processed that he had stood up. Tommy was watching him with naked curiosity. "You know her?" "Fixed her wagon wheel last week." "That all?" Ethan gave him the look that made people back up a step. Tommy backed up a step. He rode to the Whitmore farm that evening. The fence was down for 50 yards, not hard work, but it needed 2 pairs of hands, and she was already out there with post and wire, working alone again, the way she apparently did everything. She looked up when he arrived. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know." She held one side of the post while he sank it. They worked along the line as the light failed, passing tools without discussion, falling into the particular rhythm of 2 people who don't talk much, but somehow manage to work well together despite that. Or because of it. When the fence was repaired, and the light was almost gone, she looked at the work they'd done together, and nodded once with the satisfaction of someone who understands what a good job looks like. "Supper," she said, not an invitation, a statement of fact in the same tone as before. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, exactly as he had said it. A faint acknowledgement of something neither of them was naming yet. He followed her inside. This time the silence between them was different. Easier. As if the fence had not just been repaired between her pasture and the open land, but between 2 people who had been standing on opposite sides of something without quite knowing it. She told him about the farm, not the hard parts, not yet, but the parts she was proud of, the parts she had built or rebuilt or held together against odds that anyone reasonable would have considered prohibitive. He listened in the way. He listened to horses, not just to the words, but to the weight behind them, to what she was really saying about herself when she described how the grain harvest had gone, or how she had negotiated with the feed merchant last spring, or what she intended to do with the north pasture once the fence held. She was telling him that she was capable. He understood that. She was also telling him that being capable had cost her something that she had paid for every inch of this farm's survival, in ways that didn't show up in the land or the cattle or the kitchen garden, but showed up instead in the slight set of her shoulders when she talked about doing everything alone. He understood that too. "You grew up on a farm?" he asked. "Started on one, ended on this one." She met his eyes. "It's not what I planned. What did you plan?" She smiled, small, private, aimed more at herself than at him. "Something easier. I was young. I believed easy was possible." A pause. "It isn't, mostly." "No," he agreed. "But hard isn't the same as bad." She looked at the table between them. "That took me a long time to understand." He thought about that for the ride back to the Briggs ranch. He thought about it in the bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling while the other hands slept. He thought about it in the particular way you thought about things that unsettled you, turning them over and over, looking for the catch, the hidden assumption, the thing that made them false. Because his whole life had been built on a different equation. Hard had always been bad. Difficult had always been a warning sign. Struggle meant you were losing, and losing in the world he'd grown up in meant something more final than losing at cards. His father had been hard in the way of rock. Not the rock that forms mountains, but the rock that breaks things. Reginald Callahan had believed in exactly two things, work and toughness, and the toughness he believed in was the kind that required you to destroy everything soft in yourself until nothing remained that could be hurt. He had been thorough about it. Ethan would give him that. He had been thorough. Ethan had grown up in a house where the windows were drafty and the stove was unreliable, and the emotional temperature was somewhere below freezing at all times. His mother, what he remembered of her, which was less than he wanted and more than he could, sometimes there had been warmth in that cold house. A small candle of warmth that his father had not managed to extinguish before she got sick, and the sickness did it for him. After she died, the cold was total. He learned fast. The lessons his father taught were brutal but effective. Don't ask. Don't expect. Don't attach yourself to anything you can't afford to lose, because you will always be made to lose it, and the losing is worse when you cared. He had become excellent at not caring. And then he had met a woman who repaired wagon wheels with her whole body and set supper tables for two without being asked, and said things like hard isn't the same as bad. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, something in him was paying attention in a way that made him deeply, fundamentally uneasy. Because he knew what it meant when you started paying attention. It meant you had started to want something, and wanting things was where the danger was. He went back to the Whitmore farm on a Thursday, telling himself it was because the barn roof looked like it needed work from the road, and a barn roof failure would cost cattle and not in the next hard rain. And he was only being practical. He was in the vicinity. He was being practical. She didn't believe him either. He could tell by the way she looked at him when he arrived, but she didn't call him on it. She showed him the barn roof. He worked on it for most of the morning, while she was elsewhere on the farm, and when she brought him water at mid-morning, she sat on the fence nearby, and they talked in the broken, indirect way of two people who both wanted to say something, but were each waiting for the other to go first. Tommy caught him whistling to himself while he was repairing tack the following Monday, and Tommy made the mistake of commenting on it. "Don't," Ethan said. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." Tommy closed his mouth, opened it again. He was 19 and had not yet learned the lesson about self-preservation. "You've been going over to the Whitmore place a lot. She needs help with maintenance." "Sure." The one syllable had an entire conversation inside it. Ethan gave him the look. Tommy did not this time back up a step. He held his ground with the particular courage of the young and the foolish. "She's good people," Tommy said. "Lost her husband 2 years ago. Cholera, she's been alone since, running that whole farm by herself." Ethan kept working on the tack. His hands were steady. Everything else inside him was doing something that had no name but felt like the cracking of very old, very deep ice. "I know she's alone," he said, and he said it flatly, deliberately, in the tone that closed conversations. But long after Tommy had found somewhere else to be, Ethan sat with that fact. She was alone. He was alone. These were two separate conditions that did not add up to anything, and he was not in the business of addition where other people were concerned. The next time he came to the farm, she was in the kitchen garden, and she looked up at him with a directness that he had come to recognize as simply being who she was. No performance, no social management. Just Clara Whitmore, looking at you exactly as straight as she intended to look. "You keep coming back," she said, roof held in the rain. That wasn't a complaint. She stood up from where she'd been kneeling. "I'm saying I notice. You could have done that fence and the roof and let that be it. Men like you usually do. He should have let that go." He said, "What do you mean, men like me? Men who aren't used to staying anywhere." She said it without accusation, without judgment, just as a fact she had observed. "You move through places, you help when it's in your path, and you move on. You've been here 3 weeks, and you're still coming back to this farm." She was watching him with that look, the curious one. The one that turned him slightly wrong set out because he couldn't read it the way he read everything else, couldn't find the angle or the agenda in it. "What are you trying to say?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to say that you can stay if you want to," she said carefully. "Not because I need the help, though the help is real. But because," she started again. "People assume that because I'm managing alone, I want to be alone. Those aren't the same thing." He stood very still. "And I think," she said, slower now, "that you've been alone so long you've forgotten. They're not the same thing either." The air between them held that sentence. He could have disagreed. He had the words for it, the automatic words, the ones he kept ready for exactly this kind of moment, the deflection, the cold withdrawal, the performance of not caring that he had been perfecting. Since he was 8 years old, and a man with a voice like gravel had explained to him that grief was for weak people, and weak people didn't survive. He didn't use those words. He said, "I'll check the north fence tomorrow." She held his gaze for another moment. Whatever she saw in it satisfied her, because she nodded once and turned back to her garden, and there was something in that in her, not making more of it than it was, not pressing her advantage, not turning his small surrender into an occasion that reached into his chest and did something he was completely unprepared for. He rode back to the Briggs Ranch in the late afternoon, and the land stretched around him in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the way it always was. The way it had always been, for as long as he could remember, this land that took everything you gave it and gave nothing back except the bare fact of continuing to exist. He had loved this land for that reason once. The fairness of it. The honesty. It didn't pretend. But riding back through the long summer evening, he found himself thinking that maybe there were things in this world that gave back more than they took, and maybe he had simply been so careful to avoid them for so long that he had started to mistake the absence of hurt for the presence of living. He found himself thinking about what it would be like to stop riding. He was so frightened of that thought that he pushed Duke to a canter for the last half-mile, as if speed could outrun it. It could not. The thought was still there when he arrived. It was still there when he lay down in the bunkhouse. It was still there in the morning, when the sun came up, which was the most frightening thing of all, because Ethan Callahan had survived his entire life by being afraid of the right things. And he was not sure anymore whether the thought of stopping was the thing he should be afraid of, or whether the fear itself was the enemy he'd been carrying all along, wearing his father's face. He went back to the north fence the next morning, exactly as he said he would. That was the thing about Ethan Callahan that nobody in Silver Creek had discovered yet. Because nobody had given him the chance when he said something. He did it. Not out of obligation, not out of wanting to be seen as a man of his word, but because in a life that had given him very little to hold on to, keeping his own promises to himself was the one thing that remained entirely his. Clara was already outside when he arrived, moving between the barn and the house in the quick, purposeful way that told him she had been up for hours. She acknowledged him with a nod, the way someone acknowledges a fact without surprise, without performance, just simple recognition. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. He checked the fence. It held. He found 2 posts that were borderline and replaced them anyway, because borderline was how things failed, not all at once, but gradually, the steady erosion of things that were almost strong enough. He understood that particular failure mode better than most. She brought him coffee mid-morning, not the gesture of a woman being gracious. The gesture of a woman who had calculated that a man doing physical work for 3 hours needed coffee and had acted on that calculation without sentiment. You replaced the 2 posts on the far end, she said. They would have gone by fall, I know. She held her own cup with both hands. I was going to get to them. I know you were. She looked at him sideways. You're not going to say I should have asked for help. No, most men would have. I'm not most men. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. No, she said. You're really not. They stood at the fence line together for a moment, looking out at the pasture where her cattle grazed in the long morning. It was one of those silences that had started to feel, to Ethan, less like absence, and more like a kind of presence, the particular presence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill every space with noise. Then she said quietly, My husband used to say that a fence only matters if you care about what's on the inside. He didn't move. He waited. I used to think he meant the cattle, she said. Now I think he meant something else. She finished her coffee. Anyway, she turned and walked back toward the barn, and he watched her go, and the morning went on around him, and something in his chest that had been locked for a very long time shifted exactly 1 degree without his permission. He told himself it meant nothing. He had told himself a lot of things over the years. He was getting worse at believing them. By the end of that week, the hands at the Briggs Ranch had stopped pretending they weren't paying attention. He could feel it in the way conversations paused when he walked into the bunkhouse, in the careful neutrality of Harlan Briggs's expression, when Ethan mentioned, matter-of-factly, that he had spent his afternoon repairing the Whitmore barn's east wall where the planking had split. Harlan said nothing at the time. Then, 2 days later, he fell into step with Ethan on the way back from the paddock in the easy, sideways manner of a man who had decided to say something and was choosing his approach. Clara Whitmore's a good woman, Harlan said. She is. Lost a good husband. Didn't fall apart about it, which tells you something. It does. Harlan was quiet for a step or 2. She doesn't need rescuing. Ethan kept his voice level. I'm aware. I know you're aware. Another pause. What I'm saying is, don't go over there with rescuing in mind, because she'll know it and she'll shut the door and she'll be right too. He glanced at Ethan. But if you're going, because you want to go, that's a different thing entirely. Ethan stopped walking. He looked at the older man with the particular look he used when someone had said something he didn't know how to respond to, not hostility, but a kind of suspended evaluation. Harlan met it without flinching. I've been watching you for 3 weeks. You're the best hand I've hired in 10 years, and you're also the loneliest man I've ever seen, and that's saying something in this territory. He shrugged, as if loneliness were simply another condition of the weather. Just don't waste it, he said. That's all. He walked on. Ethan stood where he was for a long moment, and the afternoon moved around him, and he did not have a single word available for what he was feeling, which was itself unusual, because the thing he felt most often was nothing at all. He went to the Whitmore farm that evening. He had not planned to. He had planned to stay at the bunkhouse, to play cards badly and go to sleep early and be a man who did not go chasing after something he didn't know the name of. But the Briggs Ranch felt like a coat that didn't fit right, and the bunkhouse felt like a room he was borrowing from someone else's life. And he found himself on Duke heading north before he had fully decided to move. Clara was on the porch when he arrived, doing nothing, which surprised him. She was not a woman he associated with idleness, and the sight of her simply sitting, looking out at the last light, stopped him for a moment at the gate. She heard Duke and turned her head. She waited. He tied the horse and came up to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps without entirely knowing what to say, which was a position he was familiar with, but that he usually avoided by not arriving in the first place. "I don't have a reason," he said. She blinked once. "For what? Coming here tonight? I don't have a fence to fix or a roof to check." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Ethan." It was the first time she had used his name. He hadn't realized, until she said it, that she had been careful not to before. That she had been waiting until it meant something to say it, until saying it was the right thing and not just the available thing. He sat on the step. She stayed in the chair above him. The evening settled around them. "Tell me something true," she said. It was not a demand. It was an offer, the kind you could decline without consequences. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that a lesser woman would have filled the silence or taken it back. She didn't. "My father told me once that I cried too much when my mother died," he said. "I was 8, he said. Men didn't cry, and I was going to be a man, so I'd better learn the difference fast." He stopped. Started again. "I did learn it. He was very thorough about teaching it." The night around them, full at once, had gone fully dark, and the stars were doing their indifferent business overhead, and he did not look at her because he was not sure what he would do if he saw the expression on her face. "How thorough?" she asked carefully. He thought about how to answer that. He thought about the shed behind the house, where his father sent him when he transgressed the rules, transgression being defined as anything that looked like weakness. He thought about winters in Wyoming that you survived by not thinking about being cold. He thought about the day he turned 17 and left, and did not look back, not because there was nothing there, but because looking back was the one luxury he could not afford. Thorough enough, he said. She didn't offer him pity. He would have stood up and left if she had. She didn't offer him solutions or suggestions, or the various well-meaning wisdoms people deployed when they didn't know what else to do. She said, "Thank you for telling me that," as if it were a gift. As if he had given her something by telling her the ugliest and most basic fact of himself. He turned and looked at her then, because he couldn't not, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never in his life seen directed at him, not sympathy, not pity, not even kindness exactly, but something quieter and more durable than any of those. Something that said, "I see you, and I am not afraid of what I see, and I am not going anywhere." He looked away first. "You shouldn't look at a man like that," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Like what? Like he's worth something." The words surprised even him. He hadn't known he was going to say them until they were already out, hanging in the evening air, too honest to take back. Clara didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was careful and certain in equal measure. "What if he is?" He didn't have an answer for that. He had never in 35 years been asked that question, and he had no practiced response, no deflection ready, no retreat prepared. He just sat there on her porch step with the night around them, and the question sitting in the air like something alive. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Ethan Callahan did not know what to do with silence. He came back the next evening, and the evening after that. He told himself each time that he would stop, that this was foolishness, that he was not built for whatever this was becoming, and that the smart thing, the safe thing was to put distance between himself and Clara Whitmore before the distance became impossible. He did not put distance between them. They fell into a pattern that neither of them named. He helped with the farm work that was genuinely too heavy for one person. She fed him supper. They talked or didn't talk, in the easy way that had become its own language. He learned things about her gradually, the way you learned the contours of unfamiliar land, not all at once, but, with each visit, another piece of the map filling in. She had been 22 when she married Robert Whitmore. She had loved him, with the particular luck love of two people who understood each other's value from the beginning, and didn't need to perform it for anyone. She had buried him 2 years ago and continued alone, not because she was unafraid, but because she had looked at the alternative, selling the farm, going back east, making herself small enough to fit into someone else's life, and found it completely impossible. "I thought about leaving," she told him one evening. And there was something in the way she said it that made him understand she was telling him something she hadn't told many people. "After Robert died, I thought, this is too much. This is just too much for one person." A pause. "Then I walked out to the pasture one morning, and the light was doing something particular on the grass, and I thought, Robert loved this. He loved this land, and if I leave, I take that away from myself too." She stopped. "So I stayed." "You stayed for a dead man," he said. He meant it as a question, not a judgment. She looked at him directly. "I stayed for myself. He was just the reason I could see clearly enough to know what I wanted." He turned that over. "You think losing someone can make you see more clearly?" "I think losing someone makes everything very simple, very fast." She met his eyes. "You find out what you actually care about, when everything else gets taken away." He had found out the same thing. He had found out at 8 years old, in a cold house in Wyoming, exactly what he cared about, and exactly how easily it could be taken. And the conclusion he had reached, the 8-year-old conclusion that he had spent 27 years reinforcing, was that the answer to that equation was to care about nothing at all. He didn't say this out loud, but something in his face must have shown it, because she said, very quietly, "Ethan." He looked at her. "Caring about something isn't what breaks you," she said. "It's the only thing that doesn't." It was the most purely terrifying thing anyone had ever said to him, because he was not at all sure she was wrong. The crisis came on a Friday, 3.5 weeks after he had first stopped at her farm. It came in the form of 3 men on horseback, arriving at the Whitmore property at midday, while Ethan was mending tack in the barn and Clara was in the house. He heard them before he saw them, the kind of arrival that announced itself not just in hoofbeats, but in the particular quality of casual menace that certain men brought with them, like weather. He moved to the barn door and looked out. 3 men. He didn't know 2 of them. The third he recognized, a drifter named Cordwig Meacham, who had passed through the territory the previous year attached to a land speculation outfit that had left a trail of intimidated small farmers behind them when the business went bad. They hadn't seen him. They were looking at the house, at the farm, with the measuring look of men calculating value. "Hello, the house," Cord called out, in the friendly tone that was never actually friendly. Clara came to the door. She read the situation in one look. Ethan could see it in the way she straightened, the way her hand stayed close to the door frame. "Help you," she said. "Ma'am," Cord touched his hat brim. "We're looking to talk about your north parcel. Heard you've been having trouble keeping it up." "I haven't been having any trouble with it." "Heard different?" He smiled. "There's a gentleman in town who's interested in taking that section off your hands. Fair price. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price." Ethan walked out of the barn. The change in the 3 men was immediate, the shift from casual to alert, the recalibration that happened when a man of Ethan's size appeared from a direction they hadn't been watching. Cord's smile didn't disappear, but it changed quality entirely. "Callahan," Cord said, recognizing him. "Meacham." The 2 unnamed men looked at each other. They had done the math already. 3-to-1 was odds. 3-to-1 when the one was Ethan Callahan was a different calculation. "This is a private conversation," Cord said. She said no, Ethan said. He had stopped 12 feet from them. His hands were loose at his sides. "Conversation's done." Cord studied him for a long moment, with the eyes of a man who was weighing multiple futures, and finding none of them entirely satisfactory. "You're working for Briggs," Cord said. "Right now I'm standing in Clara Whitmore's yard." "Right now you are." Cord turned his horse, slow and deliberate, the performance of a man who is choosing to leave rather than being made to. "We'll be back when you're not standing in it." "I'll be here," Ethan said. Cord rode out with his 2 men, and the threat hanging in the air where he'd been, thick as smoke. Ethan waited until they were out of sight before he turned to look at Clara on the porch. She was standing very still, and her face had the controlled expression of a woman who was not going to show what she felt, because showing it would make it larger than she could manage. "This happened before?" he asked. "Twice," she said. "In the spring. You didn't mention it. I handled it." Clara. Something in how he said her name made her look at him differently. She came down the porch steps and stopped 2 feet from him, and this close, he could see that her hands weren't entirely steady. "Someone's been circling this land for 6 months, she said. "I don't know who. Cord Meacham's just the one they send to knock on doors." "Who owns the property east of your north parcel?" She was quiet. "Clara, a man named Victor Hale," she said. "He bought it 8 months ago. He's been buying up small properties all along this valley." She looked at him. "You know him?" Ethan was very still. "I know him," he said. And the bottom fell out of something he had not known he was standing on. Victor Hale. The name moved through him like cold water, cleaning out all the careful arrangements he had made in his thinking, all the compartments and locked rooms. Victor Hale, who had been a foreman in Ethan's father's county when Ethan was 19 and working his first real job as a ranch hand. Victor Hale, who had been charming and clever and absolutely ruthless in the way that charming, clever men sometimes were, who had found the seams in people and worked them open. Ethan had seen Hale destroy 3 families in 18 months by the time he was old enough and angry enough to try to stop him. He had failed, not because he hadn't tried, but because he had been 19 and without resources, and the people Hale worked for were the people who owned everything in that county. He had left when leaving was the only thing left to do. He had carried it with him, the particular weight of having seen something wrong and not been able to stop it. He had carried it for 16 years, folded into the back of his chest, where he kept all the other things he didn't know what to do with. "How do you know him?" Clara asked. He looked at her. He looked at this woman, who had set a place at her table for a stranger, who had sat on the porch with him in the dark and said things worth saying, who had told him that caring wasn't what broke you. And he understood with the totality of a man who had spent his whole life reading danger that Victor Hale's presence in this valley was not a coincidence. "I knew him a long time ago," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it's not." She waited. She was very good at waiting. "He's not the kind of man who gives up on what he wants," Ethan said. "And he's not the kind of man who uses fair means to get it." "I know that. You need to know it worse than you do." He heard the urgency in his own voice and did not pull it back. "Clara, this isn't just land pressure. Hale doesn't send men to knock on doors twice unless he's got a plan, and the doors are part of it." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but in the way of someone holding their own thinking together under pressure. "What kind of plan?" "I don't know yet." He looked at her. "But I'm going to find out, Ethan." She said his name the way she had learned to say it, with weight, with intention. "Whatever this is between you and Hale, you need to tell me." He had been told that before, in different circumstances and different voices, and he had never done it, had never been able to hand someone the essential, ugly contents of his history and trust that the handing would not destroy the thing he was trying to protect. He had failed at that particular act of faith every time he had been asked. He looked at Clara Whitmore, who was standing in her own yard, on her own land, with her hands not entirely steady and her eyes entirely steady, and he made a decision that felt like jumping from a height you could not see the bottom of. 16 years ago, he said, I watched Victor Hale bankrupt 3 families and put 2 men in the ground. And I couldn't stop him. She held very still. He knows who I am, Ethan continued. He'll know I'm here by now. And if he's been circling this land for 6 months, he was already interested in your property before I showed up." He paused. "But my being here will change his approach. It'll make him move faster." She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough for him to brace for what came next. The fear, the accusation, the reasonable question of whether he had brought this problem to her door by being here. "Then we need to move faster than he does," she said. He blinked. "That's all?" he said. "That's all you have to say?" She looked at him with the level, clear expression he had come to understand was her deepest self, the self that didn't perform or manage or calculate. "What do you want me to say? I just told you that my presence here might make things worse for you." "I heard you." She didn't look away. "I'm also looking at a man who just told me the truth when he didn't have to, about something he's been carrying for 16 years, because he thought I needed to know it." She paused. "That's not a man who makes things worse." The thing that happened in his chest then was not something he had words for. It was large, and it was old, and it had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and it moved through him the way water moves through cracked ground, finding every fracture, filling every gap. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said gently. "Don't try to talk yourself out of whatever just happened." "I saw it." He looked at the ground, looked back at her. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It was the most honest sentence he had ever spoken to another person. She was quiet for a moment. "Then neither do I, not anymore. Robert was a different life." She didn't say it with grief, just with honesty. "But I know how to learn things. And I think you do too, even if you've spent your whole life pretending you don't." He didn't answer, because there was no answer, because she was right. That night, back at the Briggs Ranch, he lay awake for the 3rd hour straight, and listened to the bunkhouse around him, and understood with the slow, irreversible clarity of someone watching a tide come in that he was in serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble that came from Victor Hale, though that was real and coming, and needed to be dealt with. The other kind. The kind that 17-year-old Ethan had ridden away from, and 35-year-old Ethan had apparently ridden directly back into, along a different road from a different direction. He was not afraid of Victor Hale. He had been afraid of men like Victor Hale his whole life, and the fear had long since transformed into something more useful, a cold, practical alertness that kept him 2 steps ahead. What frightened him, lying awake in the dark, was something infinitely smaller and infinitely larger, the memory of Clara's expression when she said, "I saw it." The fact that she had. The fact that he had let her. He had let her see it. He had stood there and let her look, and he had not run, and she had not looked away. 35 years of being very, very careful, and one woman on a porch in the dark had undone more of it in 3 weeks than all those years of building had managed to secure. He should be furious. He had built those walls for reasons. They had protected him. They had kept him functional, kept him moving, kept him alive in all the ways that mattered, when staying alive was the primary goal. But lying in the dark, he found that he could not, with any honesty, describe the life he had been living as a life. He could describe it as survival. He could describe it as competence. He could describe it as the steady accumulation of days that led nowhere in particular. He could not call it living. In the morning, he made a decision. He rode into Silver Creek, for the first time in a week, not to the saloon, but to the county clerk's office, where a tired man with ink-stained fingers could be persuaded, for the cost of genuine courtesy and 5 minutes of patience, to tell you who had recently filed land acquisition claims in the valley. Victor Hale had filed 3, 2 had been completed. 1 was still open, the north parcel of a property registered under the name Whitmore. He sat with that information for a moment. Then he rode to the Briggs Ranch and found Harlan Briggs in the equipment yard, and told him, without preamble, everything. About Hale, about the land filings, about his own history with the man. Harlan listened, with the focused attention of someone who had been running land in Wyoming long enough to understand exactly what kind of threat this represented. When Ethan finished, Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Then you file an objection to that open claim today. It delays him at minimum 30 days. That's your first move, and after 30 days? After 30 days, you'll have had 30 days to figure out the rest. Harlan looked at him steadily. That woman's land is worth protecting, I know. I know you know. So is she. Ethan didn't answer. Harlan didn't need him to. He rode back to town and filed the objection. He rode to Clara's farm afterward and told her what he had found and what he had done, standing in her kitchen, with his hat in his hands and the late afternoon pressing through the windows. She listened the way she always listened, fully, without interruption, her eyes on his face throughout. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "You went and did that on your own." "Yes, you could have asked me first." He met her eyes. "I could have." She held his gaze for a long, measuring moment, and he made himself hold it back, made himself not look away. "Thank you," she said finally. Not for the filing, he understood. For something larger, for going, for deciding without being asked that this was worth fighting for. "Clara," he said, and his voice was not entirely under control, which had not happened to him since he was a child. "I need you to understand something." She waited. "I don't know how to protect something without." He stopped. Started again. "I've spent my whole life keeping my distance from things I cared about. Because caring meant losing, and losing was the worst thing I knew." He looked at her directly. "I don't think I can keep my distance from this." She was very still. "From the farm," he added, and knew as he said it that they both understood he did not only mean the farm. She took one step toward him, just one. But in the particular geography of the distance that had existed between them, one step was a declaration. "Good," she said. Outside, the Wyoming evening was doing what Wyoming evenings did, vast and indifferent and spectacularly itself. Inside the Whitmore kitchen, two people who had both learned the hardest possible lessons about loss stood 2 feet apart and chose, without any guarantee and with full knowledge of what choosing cost, to remain. The 30 days bought by the objection filing did not pass quietly. Ethan had known they wouldn't. Victor Hale was not a man who sat still when his plans were interrupted. He was the kind of man who responded to resistance by applying pressure in a different place. The way water found a new path when you blocked the obvious one. Ethan had watched him operate for long enough to understand his method, and understanding them did not make them less dangerous. It only meant he could see them coming. What came first was talk. Silver Creek was a small town with a long memory and a particular appetite for stories about people. It had already decided it didn't fully trust, and Ethan had given it very little reason to trust him in the 5 weeks since he'd arrived. He was the quiet stranger with the hard face and the difficult horse and the reputation that had arrived before him. He had not worked to change that impression, because he had not, at the time, intended to stay long enough for it to matter. It mattered now. The talk started at the saloon and moved outward the way talk always did in small towns, person to person, door to door, acquiring weight and certainty with each retelling, until the original fact, whatever it had been, was barely visible inside the story that had grown around it. By the time Ethan heard the shape of it, it had become this: Ethan Callahan had a criminal past. Ethan Callahan had been run out of 2 counties before Silver Creek. Ethan Callahan was a dangerous man who had attached himself to a widow for reasons that had nothing to do with decency. He heard it from Tommy first, who delivered the information with the expression of someone who had walked into a room and found something he didn't know how to respond to. "It's all over town," Tommy said. They were working in the paddock, and Tommy kept his voice low even though there was no one within 50 yards. "People are saying things. I know, you know. I knew it was coming." He kept working. "It's what Hale does. He doesn't fight the land first. He fights the people on it." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing this. "What are you going to do?" Ethan looked up from the fence post. "Keep working." "That's it? For now." Tommy stared at him with the frustration of someone who wanted a more dramatic answer. "Ethan, people are saying you've got a criminal history. I heard one woman say she thought you were dangerous to Clara." The name landed differently than everything else. He felt it land. Who said that? Margaret Coate. She runs the general store. He put down the post driver. He looked at Tommy with an expression that made the boy take a step back. What exactly did she say? Tommy swallowed. She said a decent woman shouldn't be spending time alone with a man like you. That Clara didn't know what she'd let onto her property. He paused. She said it loud enough for people to hear. Ethan stood very still for a moment. Then he picked up the post driver again and went back to work, and his hands were steady, and his face revealed nothing, and Tommy watched him with the worried expression of someone who had just watched a person swallow something sharp. You're not going to say anything? Tommy asked. Not to Margaret Coates. Then who? He drove the post in with one clean stroke. Clara gets to decide what she does with her own life. Not Margaret Coates, not this town, not me. He looked at Tommy directly. What I'm going to do is make sure Victor Hale doesn't use people's talk to take her land. That's the part that matters. Tommy nodded slowly, working through it. And if people's talk affects her, affects what she can do in this town. Ethan looked away. Then we deal with that when it comes. It came sooner than he expected. He rode to the Whitmore farm 2 evenings later and found Clara on the porch, not sitting but standing, and there was something in her posture that told him before he'd tied Duke that the day had not been kind to her. She was holding an envelope, already opened, with the careful stillness of a person who has read something unwelcome and is deciding what to do with it. He came up the steps. She handed him the envelope without a word. The letter was from a man named Peters, a solicitor in Silver Creek, who handled most of the legal transactions in that part of the county. It informed Mrs. Clara Whitmore that a formal complaint had been filed with the county land office regarding the legal standing of her late husband's property deed, on the grounds that certain original survey markers could not be verified, and that the chain of title contained irregularities requiring investigation. Until the matter was resolved, the north parcel in question would be considered subject to dispute. Ethan read it twice. Then he set it down very carefully. This is Hale, he said. I know. The survey markers aren't in question. The deed is solid. He's creating a legal obstacle to tie up the property while he finds another angle. I know that too. She looked at him. How do I fight it? You need the original survey records. And you need a lawyer who isn't afraid of Victor Hale. The only lawyer in Silver Creek is Peters. I know, he thought. Cheyenne has lawyers who don't know Hale's name yet. Cheyenne is 4 days' ride. I know. She exhaled a controlled sound, the kind that was the last stage before something less controlled. He's done this before. It was not a question, but he answered it. Yes, in Laramie County 16 years ago, 2 families lost their land. One man lost his ranch to foreclosure 6 months after Hale's solicitor started filing paperwork. He paused. The third family fought it. They found a lawyer in Denver who knew enough about territorial land law to challenge the survey complaint directly. She looked at him sharply. Did they win? They held their land. He met her eyes. It cost them 2 years and everything they had in savings. She absorbed this. He watched her process it, the way she processed everything, directly, without the buffer of denial, taking the full weight of it and standing under it while she figured out how much she could carry. I have savings, she said. Not a lot, but some. Robert was careful. She squared her shoulders. If there's a way to fight this legally, I want to fight it legally. I'm not going to be run off my land by paperwork. He looked at her. He looked at this woman who had survived widowhood and a Wyoming winter alone and 3 visits from Cord Meacham and now a fraudulent legal complaint, and who was standing on her own porch talking about fighting it with the matter-of-fact determination of someone who had decided a long time ago that surrendering was not in her vocabulary. I'll go to Cheyenne, he said. She blinked. That's 4 days each way. I know, Briggs needs you here. I'll talk to Briggs. Ethan, she stopped, started again in a lower voice. You don't have to do this. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the careful blankness, not the controlled distance, but something open and certain and slightly frightening in its directness. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. The word sat between them. Want. The most dangerous word in his vocabulary, the one he had spent 35 years not using, and he had just said it plainly, in full light, without cover. She held his gaze for a long moment. "Okay," she said. Just that, just okay, in a voice that understood what it had cost him to say it. He talked to Harlan Briggs the next morning. Harlan listened to the full account and then sat quietly for a moment, in the manner of a man organizing his thinking. "Peters is Hale's instrument in this," Harlan said. "Yes, half the town will take Peters's word as legal gospel. Yes, and the other half are already talking about you and Clara." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "I'm aware." Harlan leaned back and looked at the ceiling briefly, then at Ethan. "You know this is going to get harder before it gets easier. Things usually do. She means something to you." It was a statement, not a question. Ethan did not insult Harlan Briggs by pretending otherwise. "Yes, then go to Cheyenne." Harlan stood up. "I'll hold your position here. But Callahan, when you come back ready to fight this in the open. No more operating around the edges. If you're going to stand with that woman, stand with her where the whole town can see it." Ethan understood what Harlan was telling him. He was telling him that half measures were over, that the moment had come when a man had to declare himself, or watch the thing he cared about be dismantled by someone willing to be more open about his intentions. He left for Cheyenne the following morning, before first light. He stopped at the Whitmore farm on his way out. Clara was awake, he had not doubted she would be. She came out when she heard Duke rapped against the early cold, and she stood at the gate while he looked at her from the saddle. 4 days there, he said. "I'll find someone good." 4 days back, she nodded. "I'll be here, if Meacham comes back." "I know what to do if Meacham comes back." She said it without impatience, just as information. Then more quietly, "Be careful." He looked at her for a moment, this woman who had asked him to be careful, as if his well-being were something she had the right to be concerned about, as if the ordinary geography of caring about someone applied to him too. He had no practice receiving that. He received it now, badly and imperfectly, the way you received something unfamiliar, with awkwardness and gratitude in equal measure. "I will," he said. He rode south. The 8 days of that journey were the most claustrophobic of his adult life, which was remarkable given that he had spent most of his adult life in open country. The claustrophobia came not from the land, but from his own head, from the 8 days of enforced distance from Silver Creek, from the enforced absence of purpose, from being alone again, after 3 weeks of not being alone, in the way he had become accustomed to not being alone. He found his lawyer on the 3rd day in Cheyenne, a young woman named Adeline Moore, who had been practicing territorial land law for 4 years out of a small office, and who listened to his account of the survey complaint with the focused attention of someone who recognized exactly what they were looking at. "This is a title harassment strategy," she said, not mincing it. "Common enough when someone wants to force a sale without paying fair market. They don't need to win the legal argument, they just need the dispute to persist long enough that the property owner runs out of money or patience. How do you fight it? You attack the filing itself. If the original survey markers are documented in the county records, you file a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the complaint misrepresents the factual record." She looked at him steadily. "Do you know who filed the original surveys on that property?" "Robert Whitmore, deceased. The filing would be in the territorial records." "Can you get me certified copies?" "Yes, then I'll file the motion." She paused. "Who am I fighting?" "A man named Victor Hale." She wrote the name down. Looked at it. "I've heard that name. From where?" "A colleague in Laramie. Something about land consolidation in that county a few years back." She met his eyes. "He left some damage behind him. He always does." She looked at him for a moment, with the evaluating expression of a professional deciding how much of what she was hearing to trust. "This isn't just about the land for you," she said. It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. "No." "Whose land is it?" "A woman named Clara Whitmore. Widow. She's been on that property for 7 years." "And you?" He held her gaze. "I'm helping." Adeline Moore wrote something in her notebook. I'll ride to Silver Creek in 10 days. I'll need to see the original deed and any correspondence she's received. She closed the notebook. Mr. Callahan, this kind of case can be won, but Hale will escalate when he sees the motion filed. That's his pattern, he escalates. I know his pattern. Make sure Mrs. Whitmore knows it too. He rode back hard. 7 days instead of 8. Pushing Duke until the horse made his objections known. And Ethan slowed down and bargained with him, the way you bargained with a difficult partner, with patience and the implicit acknowledgement that the partnership required both of them. He arrived in Silver Creek on an afternoon when the weather had turned and the sky had the particular bruised look of something preparing itself. He rode to the Whitmore farm directly, without stopping in town, without changing his direction for anything, except the fact that it was where he needed to be. He found Clara in the barn. She turned when she heard his step, and the expression that crossed her face in the first unguarded second relief, and something beyond relief. Something he did not have a word for because he had never had occasion to develop one, went through him like the first warmth of a fire after a very long cold. She recovered her composure in the next second. You're back, she said. I'm back. Early pushed. He looked at her carefully. What happened while I was gone? She was quiet for a beat too long. Clara, Meacham came back, she said, the day after you left. With 4 men this time. Something cold moved through him. Did they touch anything? No. They stayed on the road. She met his eyes. But they stayed for a long time, long enough to make a point. What did you do? She lifted her chin. I stood on the porch with Robert's rifle, and I waited. He stared at her. They left, she said, eventually. You should have sent for Briggs. I handled it. Clara, he heard the edge in his own voice, and couldn't quite smooth it. 4 men. I know what 4 men means, she said, and her voice was equally edged. I've been managing this land alone for 2 years. I'm not unfamiliar with situations that require me to make decisions without a man available to make them for me. They looked at each other across the barn, and the edge between them was real, and he recognized it for what it was, not anger exactly, but the friction that came from 2 people who both cared about something and expressed that caring in different ways that sometimes looked like conflict. He exhaled. I know you handled it, but you wish I hadn't had to. Yes, she was quiet. Some of the edge went out of her posture. So do I, she said. It was a small admission, and it cost her something, and he understood the value of it. I found a lawyer, he said. Her name is Adeline Moore. She's coming in 10 days, Clara blinked. A woman lawyer? A good one. She knows Hale's name, already knows his pattern from Laramie. She's going to file a motion to dismiss the survey complaint. He held her gaze. But she warned me. When the motion gets filed, Hale will escalate. What does that mean? It means he'll stop using Meacham and paperwork and start using something else. He paused. It means this gets worse before it ends. She absorbed this with the stillness he had come to recognize as her particular form of courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let fear make the choice. Tell me about him, she said, about Hale, everything you know. He told her. All of it this time, not the abbreviated version he'd given before, the full account, from the beginning. The county in eastern Wyoming, where he had been 19 and new to real work, and had seen for the first time in his life a man who used charm and legal manipulation the way other men used weapons. The 3 families Hale had targeted, the 2 who had lost, the one who had fought back, and the cost of fighting back. His own attempt to intervene, the failure of it, the bitter education of watching a powerful man face no consequences because consequence required someone with the standing and resources to impose them. Clara listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, That's what you've been carrying. Part of it. That's why this matters so much to you. He looked at her. It mattered to me before I knew Hale was involved. She held that for a moment. I know, she said quietly. I know, it did. And then, because she was Clara, and she didn't spend time on things that had already been settled, she said, What do we do first? They worked through it together that evening, At her kitchen table, the documents that Adeline Moore would need, the witnesses who might be willing to speak, the timeline of Hale's land acquisitions in the valley, and what they told about his larger strategy. Clara was sharp and practical, and her memory for detail was precise. And somewhere between her pulling out the original deed and him spreading the county records he'd gathered in Cheyenne across the table, something shifted in the room. A kind of solidity settled between them. The particular solidity of two people who had stopped individually managing a situation and started managing it together. He noticed it the way you noticed, the moment a fire caught, not the striking of the match, but the moment when the flame became real. Late in the evening, when the work was as done as it could be for one night, she made coffee, and he sat across from her, and the kitchen was quiet, and he said, without planning to, "I was afraid." Riding back. She looked at him over her cup. "Not of Hale," he said. "Of what I'd find when I got here." I kept. He stopped. Started again, because she deserved the honest version. "I kept thinking about all the things that could happen in 8 days when I wasn't here. And then I started thinking about what that meant. That I was thinking about it at all." She set her cup down carefully. "What did it mean?" "It meant I had something to lose." He said it, the way you said a thing you had spent a long time avoiding saying, with the particular exhaustion of a long resistance ending. "I haven't had something to lose in a very long time." "That frightens you," she said, "enormously." She was quiet for a moment. "Then it frightens me too. For the same reason." She looked at her hands. "I told myself after Robert that I was done, that it hurt too much and I was done." She looked up at him. "And then you stopped at my farm to fix a wagon wheel." He looked at her, across the table, across the coffee, and the documents, and the 8 days of distance, and the 35 years of walls he had built, and she had, without apparently trying, simply walked through. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't know how to." "I know that too. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to get it wrong." "I've never, Ethan." She said it with a gentleness that stopped him entirely. "I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm asking you to be who you actually are." She paused. "That's enough. That's more than enough." He didn't have words for what happened in him in that moment. He was not sure he would ever have words for it. He was a man who had been told at 8 years old that he was insufficient, told it systematically and thoroughly, and by someone who had the total authority of a parent. And that lesson had written itself into the operating structure of who he was at a level so deep, he had long since stopped knowing it was there. And this woman who had lost her husband and held her land, and stood on her porch with a rifle and waited for 4 men to leave, was looking at him across a kitchen table and telling him he was enough. He stood up. He walked around the table. He stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he reached out slowly, carefully, giving her every chance to move, if she wanted to, and took her hand. She did not move. He held her hand, standing in the kitchen, and neither of them spoke, and the Wyoming night pressed around the farmhouse from all directions, enormous and indifferent, and inside the house there were 2 people who had each believed, for different and equally compelling reasons, that they were done with risk, done with wanting, done with the terrible vulnerability of allowing another person to matter. They had both been wrong. Victor Hale's name came to Ethan then, in the quiet, and he felt it the way you felt the change in pressure before a storm, not the storm itself, but the certainty of it coming. Hale would escalate. Adeline Moore had said it, and Ethan knew it because he knew the man, knew the particular species of ego that did not accept defeat as a category and reframed every obstacle as a problem requiring more force. Something was coming. He could feel it, in the way he always felt things that were about to go wrong, in the practiced alertness of a man who had lived in dangerous territory long enough to read it before it moved. But standing in Clara's kitchen, holding her hand, he understood something that his 35-year-old self could never have predicted. His 35-year-old self. Neist, old self would be capable of understanding. The fear of losing something was not a reason to let go of it. It was the measure of its worth. He had been afraid of losing things his whole life. He had solved the problem by having nothing. He had been the most thorough and the successful failure at living he had ever known. He was done solving it that way. Whatever Hale brought, they would face it. He would stand in the open where Harlan Briggs had told him to stand, visible and deliberate. He would not operate around the edges. He would not keep one foot toward the door. He would stay. The decision settled into him like something finding its right place after years of being stored wrong, and he was still afraid, and it still felt like standing at a height with nothing guaranteed below. And he had no idea how to be the person Clara deserved because he had never had the chance to learn. But he was going to learn. He was 35 years old, and he had learned everything else hard and late, and he was going to learn this the same way, imperfectly, relentlessly, without giving up. Clara's hand was warm in his. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who was also making a decision, also standing at a height, also choosing to stay despite the drop below. Outside, the Wyoming wind had picked up, and somewhere across the valley, a man named Victor Hale was recalculating his approach, and the storm that Ethan had been feeling in his spine was building toward whatever it intended to become. He held Clara's hand, and he did not let go. Adeline Moore arrived in Silver Creek 9 days after Ethan returned from Cheyenne, which was 1 day earlier than promised, which told him something about her that he already suspected. She was the kind of person who said 10 day and meant noit, 'cause she built the margin in the other direction, toward the work rather than away from it. She was 31, compact and precise, in the way of someone who had learned early that the world would not make extra room for her, and had decided to be economical about the space she occupied. She carried a leather case that looked like it weighed more than was reasonable, and she had the eyes of someone who read documents the way other people read faces for what was hidden between the lines. She came to the Whitmore farm on the afternoon of her arrival, before she had even taken a room at the boarding house, because Ethan had told her time mattered, and she had believed him. Clara made coffee and spread the documents across the kitchen table, and Adeline went through them with the focused efficiency of a surgeon. Original deed, survey records, the letter from Peters, the land office filings, the chain of title back to Robert Whitmore's original claim. 20 minutes in, she looked up. "The survey complaint is fabricated," she said. "Not embellished, not stretched, fabricated. The markers Peters's filing claims are unverifiable, are documented in 3 separate county records." She looked at Clara. Whoever signed this complaint either didn't read the records or didn't care what they said. "Peters," Clara said. "Peters signed it as notary. Someone else signed it as complainant." Adeline turned the paper so they could see the signature. "A man named Ruland. Do you know him?" Ethan and Clara looked at each other. "He manages Hale's properties in this county," Ethan said. "He's not local. He came in with Hale 8 months ago." Adeline wrote the name in her notebook. Then Hale filed a fraudulent land complaint through an agent notarized by a solicitor who is either complicit or negligent. She closed the notebook with a snap. "I can have the motion to dismiss filed by end of week. But I want to depose Peters first." Clara blinked. "Can you do that?" "I can do a great many things that people don't expect." She said it without arrogance, just as information. "Peters will not be happy about it, neither will Hale." She looked at Ethan. "You told me he escalates." "He does. Then we file, we depose, and we prepare for what comes next." She stood up, closing her case. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand something. The legal argument is strong. But Hale knows the legal argument is strong. He's used this strategy before, and he knows its limits. When the motion is filed, he will look for a different lever." She paused. "In my experience, the different lever is usually personal." The words settled into the room. "Personal how?" Clara asked. Adeline looked at her steadily. "In my experience, men like Hale attack what a person values most. If it's the land, he attacks the land. If it's reputation, he attacks reputation." She paused. "If it's a person, I understand," Clara said. She didn't look at Ethan. Ethan looked at her. Clara, I understand what she's saying. Now she looked at him, and her eyes were clear and direct and completely decided. It doesn't change anything. Adeline watched this exchange with the quiet attentiveness of a professional who had learned that the cases that were really about something beyond property were the ones that required the most from everyone involved. She picked up her case. I'll be in touch by Thursday, she said. Lock those documents somewhere safe tonight. She left, and the kitchen held the shape of everything she had said, and Clara stood at the table looking at the documents, and Ethan stood by the door, and the distance between us was small in feet and large in everything that needed to be said. She's right, he said, about the personal lever. I know she is, Clara. She turned to face him. Don't stand there and tell me I should think about protecting myself from this by keeping distance from you. Because you'll dress it up as practical, and it won't be practical. It'll be you doing the thing you always do. He held very still. What thing? The thing where you find a reason that sounds sensible to give up on something before it can hurt you. She said it without heat, without accusation, just as a fact she had observed, the way she observed everything, with clear, direct eyes. I see it. Every time it starts to feel real, you start building an exit. He couldn't argue with it. It was entirely true. People are already talking about me, she continued. They were talking about me before you came. A widow running a farm alone in Wyoming, there was always going to be talk. She stepped toward him. So the question isn't whether this cost me something, in this town's opinion. The question is whether it's worth it, is it? He asked. He heard how the question sounded bare and unhidden, nothing protective around it. She looked at him for a long moment. You've been coming to this farm for 5 weeks, she said. You fixed my wheel and my fence and my barn's roof, and you rode 8 days to Cheyenne and back because my land was in trouble. You told me things last night that I don't think you have told anyone. She paused. Yes, Ethan, it's worth it. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and he did what he had not yet done. He put his arms around her, carefully, the way you held something you were not entirely sure you had the right to hold, and she let him. And her hands came up to hold his forearms, and they stood in the Whitmore kitchen in the late afternoon, with the documents on the table, and Victor Hale somewhere in the county preparing his next move, and none of it, for 30 seconds, was the most important thing in the room. He stepped back first, not away, just to where he could see her face. Whatever he brings, Ethan said, I'm not leaving. She looked at him. That's new, she said quietly. Yes, he agreed. It is. He did not sleep at the Briggs Ranch that night. He slept on Clara's porch, which was not comfortable and was entirely necessary, because whatever Adeline Moore had said about the personal lever had settled into the part of him that read threats before they arrived, and that part of him had been running cold all evening. He was right to stay. At 3 a.m, Duke woke him. The horse tied at the post registered something before Ethan did. The shift of weight and the flick of an ear that meant something in the dark had moved that shouldn't have. Ethan was on his feet before he was fully awake, which was a skill built over many years and many situations that required it. He saw the glow before he understood it, the north fence. The far end of the north pasture, where he had replaced 2 posts the first week and where Clara's cattle grazed. The glow was wrong, and it was moving, and it took him exactly 2 seconds to understand what it was. He was running before the 2 seconds were done. He hit the barn door, threw it open, grabbed the emergency water buckets that every working farm kept filled, and was yelling for Clara by the second bucket. She came out of the house already half awake, read the glow in the field in one look, and ran for the second set of buckets without a word from him. They ran together. The fire was in the grass at the fence line, deliberately set. He understood instantly, placed to move toward the cattle, but not to destroy the fence itself, because destroying the fence would leave evidence of the line and how it had been lit. Someone had planned this carefully. Someone had wanted the cattle to scatter in panic, wanted the damage to be about the livestock rather than the property, wanted it to look like accident or misfortune rather than deliberate harm. They fought it for 40 minutes. The grass was dry, but the wind was low, which was the only mercy, and Clara fought with the same physical economy. She brought to everything no panic, no wasted motion, just the clear-headed application of effort to the actual problem. By the time they had it out, the north fence line had a scorched 30 feet, and the cattle had pushed to the far end of the pasture, but were unhurt. Clara stood at the edge of the burned patch, breathing hard, her face marked with smoke. She looked at the deliberate line of origin, the start point, too neat for accident. He did this, she said, not him personally. Ethan was already reading the ground around the start point. Someone he sent, tonight, after Adeline Moore left. He looked up at her. He knew about the visit. She absorbed this how? Small town. Someone saw her arrive at your farm and reported it. He stood up. This is the escalation. He couldn't stop the legal motion, so he moved to pressure on the land itself. He's trying to make the farm too costly to keep, she said. Yes, she looked at the burned patch for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him. Go get Tommy, and whoever else Briggs will lend us tonight. I want someone at each fence line before sunrise. He looked at her. Clara, I know what I'm asking. I'm asking for help, she said it evenly, without it costing her. I'm learning. He went. He was back within an hour with Tommy and 2 other Briggs hands, who had stress-ridden without question when Ethan had knocked on the bunkhouse door and used a tone of voice that did not leave room for deliberation. Harlan Briggs had come to the door as they were riding out, taken one look at Ethan's face, and said only, "Send for me if it goes worse." It did not go worse that night. The 4 of them covered the perimeter until morning, and morning came cold and clear and without further incident, and Clara fed everyone breakfast at her table, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who knew that feeding people was its own form of leadership. Tommy ate and watched Clara and Ethan in the particular way of young people who were witnessing something they didn't fully understand, but recognized as significant. She's something, Tommy said to Ethan quietly, afterward, while they were checking the burned fence line, in daylight. Yes, Ethan said, you're going to stay, aren't you? Not just here, I mean in Silver Creek. Ethan looked at the scorched grass. At the fence he had helped repair. At the land that had become, without his fully noticing when it happened, a place he thought of as somewhere, rather than just somewhere he was passing through. Yes, he said. Tommy nodded slowly, like he was confirming something he had suspected for a while. Good, he said, and left it at that, because Tommy, when he chose to be, was capable of knowing when enough was said. Adeline Moore filed the motion to dismiss on Thursday as promised. By Saturday, the news of the filing had moved through Silver Creek, with the speed that legal events always generated in small towns fast, because everybody had some stake in property and everybody understood, at the basic level, what a fraudulent land complaint meant about the man who had filed it. The reaction was not uniform. Some people, the ones who had already decided about Ethan, the ones who had been listening to Hale's version of things through intermediaries like Margaret Coates, dismissed the motion as a legal technicality, a maneuver rather than the truth. But others, particularly those who had been in the county long enough to remember fair dealing and recognize its absence, began asking questions they hadn't asked before. Harlan Briggs was one of them. He had been asking questions in the quiet, purposeful way of a man who carried genuine weight in the community, and on the Sunday after the motion was filed, he organized what he called a dinner, and what was in reality a meeting, at the Briggs Ranch, to which he invited 12 men who owned property in the valley and who all had, in the last 8 months, received some form of inquiry from representatives of Victor Hale's land acquisition operation. Ethan came, Clara came, Adeline Moore came with her leather case. Adeline laid out the facts with the clean precision she brought to everything. The fraudulent survey complaint, the pattern of acquisition, what the county records showed about Hale's methods, what had happened in Laramie County 16 years ago, and what it had cost the people there. The room was quiet in the particular way of people absorbing information that connected things they had individually experienced, but not yet understood as connected. A rancher named Durward, who had been in the valley for 20 years, and whose north pasture bordered two of Hale's recent acquisitions, said, "He made me an offer last month. Unsolicited. Told me the county assessor had been doing a review of my title, and there might be questions." Clara said quietly, "The same thing, another man. He sent someone to talk to my wife when I was out working. And another. He told my bank he'd heard I was having financial trouble." The room filled with this, not voices overlapping, but a sequence, careful and heavy, each account landing like another stone on a scale that was already tipping clearly in one direction. These were men who had not spoken to each other about this, because they had each experienced as a private trouble, a personal pressure, something to be managed individually. Understanding that it was coordinated, that they were not each a unique target, but part of a mapped strategy, changed something in the room's temperature. Ethan watched this change happen and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something more complicated, the particular sensation of seeing a thing you had failed to stop 16 years ago, finally meeting resistance. Finally encountering people who would not be moved individually, because they were no longer standing individually. Harlan Briggs said, "At the end, what we need to know is whether this is the kind of thing we fight or the kind of thing we absorb." A pause. Durward said, "I've been absorbing land pressure from better men than Victor Hale for 20 years. I'm done absorbing." The vote, when it came to it, was not formal because it didn't need to be. It was the kind of collective decision that declared itself in nods and the set of faces, and the way men who had been sitting with private burdens straightened in their chairs when they realized they were not carrying them alone. They would file supporting objections to every outstanding Hale land claim in the county. They would share documentation. They would give Adeline Moore what she needed to build the fullest possible legal case. And they would make it visible, not aggressive, not vigilante, but visible, because visibility was the thing that Hale's strategy most depended on not having. On the way home from the Briggs Ranch, riding side by side in the late evening, Clara said, "That was the turn." Yes, Ethan agreed. He didn't expect them to talk to each other. Men like Hale never do. They operate on isolation. Keep each person convinced they're dealing with a private problem. He paused. Once the isolation breaks, the strategy breaks with it. She was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this for 16 years. I've been thinking about what I should have done differently." Yes. He kept his voice level. "I was 19. I didn't have the standing or the knowledge. I tried to fight it alone and I lost and I left." He paused. "I won't leave this time." She looked at him sideways in the dark, with the expression he had come to understand as her version of certainty. "I know," she said. "Victor Hale came to Silver Creek in person on a Tuesday, which was not something Ethan had expected, but which, in retrospect, made a particular kind of sense. Hale was a man who understood that personal presence conveyed something that paperwork and intermediaries couldn't, the direct pressure of a personality that had been using its full weight on people for decades and expected that weight to work. Ethan was at the Whitmore farm when he arrived. He heard the horses on the road and came out to Offrent and saw the carriage and knew before it stopped what it contained. Victor Hale looked exactly as he remembered, and nothing like what he remembered simultaneously. The surface was the same, the careful grooming, the quality of the coat, the face that was built for projecting confidence and reasonable dealing. But he was older, which Ethan had known intellectually, without quite feeling it until now, and there was something in the eyes that had gone harder, or perhaps had always been hard, and Ethan was simply old enough now to recognize it for what it was. Hale stepped down from the carriage and looked at the farm, and then at Ethan with the particular expression of a man encountering something he had accounted for, but not fully credited. "Callahan," he said. "Hale, it's been a long time." 16 years. Hale looked at him for a moment. You were just a boy then. I was old enough to see what you were doing. Something shifted in Hale's expression, not much, but enough. I'm here to speak with Mrs. Whitmore. I'd like to make her an offer that resolves this situation for everyone. She's heard your offers, not this one. Ethan did not move from where he was standing. What kind of offer? A generous one, fair market value for the north parcel, clean title transfer, no further legal proceedings. Everybody walks away satisfied. He paused. This doesn't have to be difficult. You filed a fraudulent complaint, Ethan said. You had men start a fire on her fence line. You sent someone to intimidate her when I was out of the county. His voice was level. Not loud. Level was worse than loud, and he knew it. You don't get to come here with a clean offer after that. Hale looked at him with the eyes of a man recalculating. You know, Hale said, and his voice dropped into the register he used, when he wanted something to feel inevitable, your being here is going to make this harder for her. You understand that, don't you? Whatever history you think gives you standing here, all it actually does is give me additional material to work with. He paused. Your history isn't clean, Callahan. The things a man does at 19, at 25 people are very interested in that kind of information. Small towns even more so. Ethan had been expecting this. He had been expecting it since Adeline Moore said personal liver, and he had understood exactly what that meant in his specific case. He had spent the past week thinking about it. Thinking about what it would mean when his actual history, not the reputation, not the rumor, but the specific documented actions of a man who had lived hard in hard places and made choices that were not all defensible, was put in front of Silver Creek to evaluate. He had thought about it, and he had made a decision. He did not look away from Hale. Go ahead, he said. Hale blinked. It was a small blink, but it was real. I beg your pardon. Whatever you have, whatever you've found, go ahead and use it. He held the man's gaze. Because I've already told Clara everything. And she's still here. And this town is going to hear 2 stories, yours about me, and mine about you, and what you did in Laramie County, and what you've been doing in this valley for 8 months. He paused. You can decide which story people are more interested in. Hale was very still. This was the moment Ethan understood that either held or broke. Hale was calculating. He could see it happening. The rapid reassessment of what he had come here to do, the recalibration of what leverage was actually available to him. He had come expecting isolation. He had come expecting a man who was still hiding, still ashamed, still operating from the defensive crouch that shame produced. He had not come expecting someone who had already turned his own vulnerabilities over and decided they were not going to be used as weapons. You think you can fight me in this county, Hale said. I think 12 property owners in this valley are already filing supporting objections to every land claim you've made. I think a lawyer in Cheyenne has your name connected to a fraudulent legal complaint and a pattern of conduct going back to Laramie. He kept his voice even. I think you came here personally, because you're more concerned than you want to appear. Clara came out of the house. She had been inside, she had heard the carriage, had chosen to let Ethan handle the approach, and now she came down the porch steps and stood beside him. She looked at Hale. I know who you are, she said. I know what you did to get to where you are. I know what you've been trying to do to my land. She paused. My answer is no, whatever the offer is. The answer was no before you came, and it's no now. Hale looked at the 2 of them standing together. He looked at the farm. He looked at something in the middle distance that might have been a calculation, or might have been something closer to recognition. The recognition of a man who had spent many years relying on other people's isolation, and was looking at 2 people who were not isolated. He got back into his carriage without another word. They watched him go. Clara let out a long, controlled breath. Then she said, That's not over. No, Ethan agreed. But it's different. How? He came in person, Ethan said. Men like Hale only come in person when they're not sure their remote methods are working. He came to assess. He watched the carriage reach the road and turn. What he found is going to change his thinking. She looked at him sideways. You told him to go ahead, yes. You told him to use whatever he had. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Were you afraid? He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. Yes, but you said it anyway. You told me once that caring about something isn't what breaks you, he said. I decided to believe you. Something crossed her face, something large and briefly unguarded that she let him see before it settled into the quiet steadiness he knew. She reached out and took his hand, standing in front of her farm, in full sight of the road and anyone who might be on it. The whole town can see us, he said. Good, she said. Let them. He tightened his hand around hers, and they stood there together in the afternoon, on ground that was hers and that he was going to help her keep, and the fear was still there. It would probably always be there. He understood now. Because the capacity to be afraid was the same capacity as the capacity to care, and he was not going to separate them again. But it was no longer the largest thing in him. What was largest in him was this, her hand in his, on her land, in the open, with nothing hidden. The weeks that followed were hard. Hale did not retreat cleanly. He was not a man who retreated cleanly. He made 3 more attempts through different channels, each one slightly less aggressive than the last. Each one meeting the same coalition of county property owners, and the same lawyer from Cheyenne, and the same woman who would not be moved, and the same man standing beside her. Peters, the solicitor, facing a deposition from Adeline Moore, quietly withdrew his professional involvement from Hale's operations in the county. Cord Meacham was not seen again. The legal motion to dismiss the fraudulent survey of complaint was heard by the county magistrate in the 3rd week of September, and was granted in full. The magistrate, a meticulous man named Greer, who had been in his position long enough to recognize a manufactured legal dispute, dismissed the complaint, with language that was, by the standards of legal documents, fairly colorful about the quality of the evidence behind it. Hale left Silver Creek shortly afterward. He did not announce his departure. One day, Ethan heard from Tommy that the carriage had been seen heading south, and the property that Hale had been using as his base of operations in the county was being closed. He did not know where Hale went. He did not waste much energy on it. Men like Hale went where the next opportunity was, carrying their methods with them, and the damage they did could not all be accounted for. But this particular damage, in this particular valley, had been stopped. He told Clara the night he heard. She was quiet for a long time, and he understood she was not simply processing the information, but processing everything that had come with it, the months of pressure, the nights of fear she had not shown, the weight of defending something alone, until she was no longer alone. It's done, he said. Yes, she said. You're all right? She looked at him. I'm better than all right. A pause. I kept thinking all through this. I kept thinking about what Robert would have thought. About you, about all of it. She stopped. He would have liked you. He was the kind of man who could see past the surface of a thing. She looked at her hands. He would have been glad. Ethan was quiet with that for a moment. There was nothing easy to say, and he didn't try to say something easy. I'm glad he loved this land, he said finally, because you stayed. She looked up at him. So am I, she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the Whitmore kitchen, his kitchen. Now, in some way he was only beginning to understand, because a kitchen could belong to you without your name on any deed, could become yours in the way that mattered most. Through the accumulation of evenings and meals and conversations, and the specific silence of 2 people who had stopped performing and started simply being, and outside the Wyoming night did what it always did, enormous and indifferent, and inside the house something had settled that had been unsettled for a very long time. In both of them, in ways they were only beginning to have language for. He was staying. He had said it to Tommy and meant it, and it had not stopped being true since he said it. He was staying in Silver Creek, on this land, beside this woman, in this life that he had ridden into without knowing it was what he was riding toward. He had spent 35 years in motion because stopping required, trusting that the place you stopped was worth stopping for. He had not believed such a place existed. He had been wrong about that, which was an unusual experience for a man who had built his entire survival on being right about what was dangerous and what wasn't. He had been wrong. He was glad of it in a way he had no practice expressing, but he was going to learn that too, along with everything else he was going to learn. Imperfectly and late, and with the stubborn persistence of a man who had decided that living was worth the price of vulnerability, even at 35, even now, even when the learning was the hardest thing he had ever done. He held Clara's hand in the kitchen, and he did not let go, and that was enough, and more than enough, and everything. The morning after Hale left Silver Creek for the last time, Ethan woke before dawn and lay still for a long moment, listening to the particular quality of silence that came after a threat had passed. It was different from ordinary silence. It had space in its room that had been occupied by tension for so long that its absence felt almost physical, like a hand that had been pressing on your chest, finally lifting away. He got up. He made coffee on the Briggs Ranch stove, while the other hand slept, and he stood in the early dark with the cup in his hand. And he thought about the fact that he had nowhere he needed to be this morning except where he chose to go. That was new. That was, he realized, something he had not experienced in his adult life, the sensation of a day that opened in front of him, not as territory to be crossed or a threat to be managed, but as something he could simply inhabit. He rode to the Whitmore farm. He did not examine why. He had stopped examining why some time ago, and the stopping had been its own kind of progress. Clara was in the kitchen when he arrived, which he could tell from the lamp in the window. She was always up before light, which was one of the things he had learned about her, the way you learned things about people you spent genuine time with. Not from being told, but from simply being present long enough to observe. He tied Duke and came to the door and knocked, which he also still did. Because knocking was the visible acknowledgement that this was her home, and he was a person who respected that fact, even when every other part of his behavior suggested he had begun to think of it as partly his. She opened the door and looked at him with the expression she used when she was not surprised by something, but was glad of it anyway. "Coffee's made," she said. "I know, I could smell it from the gate." She stepped back to let him in, and he came into the kitchen. And the warmth of it closed around him the way it always did, not just the warmth of the stove, but the warmth of the room itself. The accumulated warmth of a place that had been lived in by people who cared about it. They sat across from each other and drank their coffee, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that had been built over weeks of mornings and evenings, and shared work and shared trouble. The kind of silence that was not empty, but full of everything that had been said, and everything that didn't need saying, because it was already understood. Clara said, "I slept well last night, so did I." First time in a while, yes, she looked at her cup. "I keep waiting to feel like it's over, fully over." A pause. "It doesn't quite feel that way yet. It won't for a while," he said. "That's normal. When something's been pressing on you that long, the pressure doesn't just stop when the cause does. It takes time for your body to believe it." She looked at him. "That sounds like experience." "It is." He held her gaze. "After I left my father's house, I spent 2 years expecting him to come after me. He didn't. He wasn't the kind of man who came after things he'd thrown away." A pause. "But I didn't know that yet. So I kept looking over my shoulder for a long time." She was quiet, absorbing this, and then she asked, "And then one morning I woke up, and I realized I hadn't looked over my shoulder in a week." He set his cup down. "That's how it ends, not all at once, a little at a time until you notice the absence." She nodded slowly. "I can wait for that. You've waited for harder things." "So have you." They looked at each other across the table, and the morning came up around the farmhouse, the way mornings did, gradually, then completely. The dark giving way to gray, giving way to the particular pale gold of early light, and neither of them moved to break the moment, because there was nothing in it that needed breaking. It was Tommy who first used the word that nobody else had said yet. He said it 3 weeks later on a Saturday, when he arrived at the Whitmore farm with Ethan to help repair the section of the north fence that the fire had damaged beyond the initial repair. They had been working for 2 hours when Tommy, who had the self-regulation of a 19-year-old in most things, but occasionally produced an observation of startling accuracy, stopped working and looked at Ethan with the direct expression of someone who had been thinking about something and decided to say it. "You know this is home," Tommy said. Ethan drove a post without looking up. "Is that a question?" "No." Tommy leaned on the fence. "I'm just saying you know it. You wake up here before the Briggs Ranch. You know where she keeps the extra nails and which of the cattle needs watching and what the north pasture does in heavy rain." He paused. "That's not being a hired hand. That's knowing a place." Ethan was quiet. "I know it," he said. Tommy nodded. "Okay." And went back to work, which was the thing about Tommy. When he was at his best, he knew when the saying was enough. Ethan drove the next post, and the fence line held solid, and the October sky above the Wyoming Valley was the particular deep blue that only happened at this altitude in this season, and he was home. He had known it for a while. He had known it, the way you knew things that were too large to examine directly peripherally, in the corner of your vision, becoming more visible, the less you turned to look at it. He was home. The question that arrived with that knowledge was large and simple, and frightened him more than Victor Hale had frightened him, more than anything external had frightened him in years. Because it was entirely internal, entirely about whether he was capable of asking for the thing he wanted, rather than simply being near it, and hoping that nearness was enough. He had been near it for 2 months. He had held her hand and told her the truth about his father, and ridden 8 days to Cheyenne, and stood in front of Hale without flinching. And he had done all of those things without asking the question, because asking the question was the most exposed position he could occupy, the position with no wall behind it and no exit to one side, the position that was simply, "This is what I want. And I am saying so, and there is no taking it back." He stayed with the question for 3 more days. He turned it over the way he had turned over all the other frightening things in his life. With patience, looking for the catch, looking for the reason not to. He was thorough about it, he always was. He could not find a reason that held. On a Wednesday evening, he came to the farm after work, and there was something different in how he arrived, not in his pace or his expression, which were the same, but in some quality underneath that Clara registered the moment he came in. Because she looked at him, and something in her own expression shifted into the careful attentiveness she used for things that mattered. "Sit down," she said. "I was going to Ethan." She said his name the way she always said it, with full weight, full intention. "Sit down." He sat down. She sat across from him and put her hands flat on the table and looked at him with her eyes entirely open, not performing patience but simply being it. He said, "I want to stay." She waited, "Not the way I've been staying. Not coming in the morning and leaving at night." He looked at her hands on the table, then at her face. "I want to stay the right way. Formally, properly." He was speaking carefully, choosing each word the way you chose footing on uncertain ground, deliberately, with attention to what would hold. "I know I'm not. I know there are things about me that aren't easy. I know my history isn't clean, and I know I don't always find words for things in the moment. And I know I am late, by any reasonable measure, to understanding how to be what a person should be to someone they—" He stopped. Looked at her directly. "To someone they love." The word was out. There was no room around it, and no way past it, only through it. Clara's expression had gone very still, not closed, the opposite. Open in the way of something that had been waiting to open for a long time. "You love me," she said, not a question, a statement she was testing the sound of. "I don't know when it started," he said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know if it was the wagon wheel or the fence or the porch or somewhere in the middle of all of it. I just know that when I try to think about the future—" He stopped. Started again. "I can't see one that makes any sense without you in it. And I am aware that's a large thing to say to a person, and I'm aware I don't have the practice to say it the way it should be said, but it is exactly and completely what is true. And I have committed to telling you the truth even when it costs me something. So." He stopped talking. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Long enough for the silence to have a shape, long enough for him to feel the full exposure of what he had just done. Standing in the middle of his own honesty, with nothing between him and whatever she said next. Then she said, "I loved Robert truly and completely, and I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not pretend that losing him was anything other than the hardest thing I have survived." Her voice was steady and clear. "And I also know the difference between loving a memory and loving the person sitting across my kitchen table in the present tense." She met his eyes. "I know the difference, Ethan." He held very still. "You are not a replacement for what I lost," she said. "You are something entirely different that I did not expect, and did not look for, and would not trade." She paused. "And yes, I love you. I have loved you since somewhere around the third fence post, if you want the honest answer." Something happened in him that he did not have a word for and did not need one. It moved through him, the way the first warm day moves through ground that has been frozen, not violently, not with drama, just with the steady, irreversible fact of thawing, of things becoming possible that had been impossible, of ground becoming ground again. He reached across the table and took her hands. She let him. She held his hands back with the same steady grip she brought to everything, not tentative, not hedged, but present. Fully, entirely present. "I want to do this the right way," he said. "I want to ask you to marry me, and I want to do it the right way, and I have no ring, and I gave you no warning, and I understand if, Ethan, if you need time or if you think it's too." "Ethan," he stopped. "Yes," she said. He stared at her. "Yes?" he said. "Yes." She said it, with the faint expression he had come to understand was her closest equivalent to laughter, the private, warm acknowledgement of something that pleased her. "Was that not clear? I didn't finish asking." "You asked," she said. "You asked clearly and directly and without unnecessary ceremony, which is exactly how you do everything, and my answer is yes." She looked at him steadily. "It was always going to be yes. I was waiting for you to get there." He sat with that for a moment, the particular grace of it, the particular gift, of being known well enough that someone could tell you they had been waiting for you to arrive, at something you had to arrive at in your own time, without pressure, without the waiting being held against you. He had not known that was a thing that could be given. He was going to have to expand his understanding of what could be given. Harlan Briggs was the first person Ethan told, because Harlan had told him not to waste it, and Ethan believed in honoring the advice of people who had been right. He found Harlan in the equipment yard the next morning and told him plainly he was going to marry Clara Whitmore, and he was going to need to make some changes to his arrangements at the ranch. And he wanted to be the one to say it directly rather than have Harlan hear it from someone else. Harlan listened. Then he put out his hand and Ethan shook it, and Harlan said, "About time," which Ethan chose to interpret as congratulations. Tommy, when told, produced a sound that was somewhere between a shout and a laugh and slapped Ethan on the shoulder, hard enough to mean something, which Ethan accepted as the highest available form of Tommy's approval. The news moved through Silver Creek with the speed that news always moved in small towns, which was the speed of light relative to other forms of information. The reactions it generated were not uniform. Ethan had never expected them to be, and he had made his peace with that, had made it deliberately, as a choice, because the alternative was to keep accommodating other people's doubts about him, and he had decided that was done. Margaret Coates at the general store, who had been the most vocal about what a decent woman shouldn't do, was cold on the two occasions Ethan came in for supplies in the week after the news circulated. He paid for his goods and said good morning and left without engaging, which was the right strategy and which he managed without difficulty because he had years of practice not needing other people's approval, and this particular instance of not having it was the least difficult of his life. What surprised him genuinely surprised him, in the way that things surprised him now, which was differently from before, with more room for it, was the other side of the reaction. Durward, the rancher, who had spoken first at Harlan's meeting, stopped him on the road one afternoon and said, "Heard the news." Good man, just that, direct and plain, which was the form of compliment Ethan could actually receive. The wife of one of the other property owners from the meeting brought food to the farm the week after the engagement, which was the frontier equivalent of a benediction. Clara thanked her at the door with the gracious ease of a woman who understood what the gesture meant. And Ethan stood behind her and understood it too. The town was not unanimous. The town would probably never be unanimous about him, and he had stopped expecting it to be. But it was moving, in its slow, communal way, from suspicion toward something more complicated and more honest, toward the recognition that the cold stranger who had ridden into Silver Creek in the summer was also the man who had ridden to Cheyenne for a woman's land, and stood on her porch and told Victor Hale to go ahead. People in frontier towns understood that particular kind of character. They were surrounded by land that required it. The wedding was in November, when the harvest was in and the worst of the pre-winter work was done. And the community had the breathing room to gather for something that was not work or crisis. Harlan Briggs offered his property for the gathering. Adeline Moore, who had returned to Cheyenne after the legal victory and had since become something like a friend, the kind of friend you made through shared difficulty, which was the most durable kind, rode back for the occasion. They married in the morning. Clara wore the dress she had made herself, which was practical and beautiful in the way that she was practical and beautiful, without apology or excess. Ethan wore his best clothes, which were not fine, but were clean and pressed and represented the furthest distance he had traveled from the man who had ridden into Silver Creek with nothing but a bedroll and a bad-tempered horse. He stood at the front of the gathered people, and he was afraid. He had accepted by now that he was going to be afraid at the important moments. And that fear was not a verdict on the thing, but a measure of it, and he let the fear be there and stood in it, and did not run. Clara came to stand beside him, and she looked at him with those clear, direct eyes, and the fear was still there, and underneath it was something so much larger that the fear simply did not have the room it had once had. When it came to the words, he said them plainly, and without faltering, in the voice that was his, not smooth, not practiced, but genuine. He had learned, over the months since he had stopped at a broken wagon wheel on a Wyoming road, that genuine was worth more than smooth. That the rough, honest version of a thing carried weight that the polished version couldn't. Clara said her words with the same steadiness she brought to everything, and her voice did not break, and her eyes did not leave his face. Afterward, people gathered and ate, and the November afternoon went on around them, and Ethan moved through it, in the particular, slightly disoriented way of a man who had spent his entire life on the outside of exactly this kind of human occasion, and was now, inexplicably, at the center of one. People spoke to him, he spoke back. He was not fluid at it, he was never going to be fluid at it, but he was present, actually present, which was something he was learning to distinguish from mere attendance. Tommy at some point materialized at his elbow, with a cup and an expression of unsubtle satisfaction. "How does it feel?" he asked. Ethan looked across the room at Clara, who was talking to Adeline Moore with the animation of a woman who had found a real friend in an unexpected place, and he considered the question, honestly. "Frightening," he said. Tommy frowned slightly. "That's not what people usually say." "I know," he kept watching Clara, "but it's true, because the bigger something is, the more frightening it is to have it." He paused. "The trick is staying anyway." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing this with the particular seriousness he applied to things he was going to keep. "That's the trick," he said. "That's the whole trick," Ethan agreed. The winter that followed was the hardest in a decade by Wyoming standards, which meant it was hard in ways that would have broken a different arrangement. The cold came early and stayed late. The work was relentless. There were weeks when the daily demands of the farm and the cattle and the weather left no room for anything except function, waking up, doing what needed doing, falling into the sleep of the genuinely exhausted. But something had changed in the interior of Hard. Clara had told him, in those first weeks, that hard wasn't the same as bad, and he had turned the sentence over for months, without fully believing it. He believed it now. He believed it in the specific, practical way of a man who had experienced the difference, who had known hard, that was only hard, grinding and cold and without purchase, and now knew hard, that was hard with something underneath it, something that held. They fought, not often and not viciously, but genuinely the way two people fought, when they both had strong ideas and strong voices, and had not grown up deferring. Clara had a stubbornness that matched his own, and a directness that sometimes felt like an edge, and he had a tendency to go silent when he should speak, that drove her to a particular quality of frustrated patience. They were learning. The fighting was part of the learning, and after each one, they came back to each other with the slightly chastened honesty of people who had seen the worst of themselves in front of someone who had not left because of it. He had not known that was possible. He was revising a great many things he had not known were possible. The revision he was least prepared for was the one that arrived in the spring. Clara told him in March, in the early morning, in the kitchen, with the matter-of-fact directness that she brought to everything, including this. She watched his face as she said it, and he sat very still for a long moment, and then he put his face in his hands, and she made a small sound of alarm and reached across the table. "Ethan," she said. "Ethan, look at me." He looked up. His face, she told him later, was something she had never seen on it before, completely undefended, every careful arrangement gone. Just the raw face of a man who had been told something that had gone through every wall he had ever built as if they were made of air. "You're all right?" she said, because she wasn't yet certain what she was seeing. His voice was not available in its normal register. He stopped, started again. "I grew up believing I would never another stop. That I was not the kind of person who what?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, finally, as the face of a man who was meeting himself for the first time. "Who had this?" he said. "Any of this?" She took his hands across the table. Her grip was warm and certain and entirely real. "You were always going to have this," she said. "You just had to find your way to it." He held her hands, and he did not trust his voice enough to say anything. So he didn't say anything, and that was all right, because Clara had always understood that the between was not empty. Their daughter was born in October. They named her Margaret, not for Margaret Coates, but for Ethan's mother, the woman he had remembered, as a voice he could barely hear, the woman he had learned to grieve properly, only after he had learned to stop being afraid of grief. Clara had suggested the name. After he told her the story one evening, and when he looked at her across the table with his whole unguarded face, she had simply said, "It's a good name. Some names deserve to come back." He held Margaret for the first time with the terrified care of a man who had handled difficult horses, and survived hard winters and faced dangerous men, and discovered that none of it had prepared him for holding something this small and this entirely dependent on him to be something he was still learning how to be. The baby looked at him with the unfocused, earnest eyes of the newborn, and he said nothing for a long time, just held her and let the fact of her be completely real, and Clara watched from the bed with the exhausted, open expression of someone who had just done the hardest work of her life, and was content with the outcome. "She looks like you," Clara said. "She looks like herself," he said. "That's what I meant." He looked at his wife and his daughter and the room that was his home, and the October morning pressed against the windows, and he understood not theoretically but in his body, in the actual physical substance of the moment, that the boy who had been told he was unworthy of love had become a man holding the most complete evidence to the contrary that the world was capable of producing. It had not been easy, it had not been clean, it had required more of him than he had known he had, which it turned out was less than he had feared, because what had felt like a deficit in himself had mostly been the accumulated weight of being told, by someone who should have known better, that he was not enough. He had spent 35 years organized around that belief. He had spent the last year and a half disorganizing himself from it, slowly and imperfectly, and with Clara's steady presence as the thing that made the disorganizing possible. He was not the same man who had ridden into Silver Creek with empty eyes and a horse as bad-tempered as his silence. He was also not a different man. He was the same man, with the walls gone, which turned out to be the person he had always been before the walls were built. Before an 8-year-old boy was told that his grief was a weakness and his need for comfort was something to be ashamed of. He was that boy grown, arrived finally at a life that had room for all of him. Margaret made a small sound in his arms, and he adjusted his hold, carefully, and she settled, and he breathed. Tommy came by to meet the baby that afternoon, arriving with the kind of barely suppressed excitement of someone who had been waiting to be summoned. He stood in the doorway and looked at Ethan holding Margaret, and his face did something that Ethan recognized, the face of someone seeing a thing they had hoped for but not fully allowed themselves to expect. "She's perfect," Tommy said. "Yes," Ethan agreed, without qualification or deflection, which was its own kind of landmark. Tommy looked at him. "You're different," he said, in the wondering tone of someone observing something they could see but not entirely account for. Ethan considered this. He looked at his daughter's face. He looked at Clara, watching from the doorway to the bedroom, with her arms crossed and the expression she used when she was content. He looked at the kitchen he had come to know better than any place he had ever been, the table, the stove, the window that faced east, and caught the morning light. "I learned something," he said. Tommy waited. "I spent my whole life thinking love was a risk," Ethan said. "The kind of risk you could either take or avoid." He looked at Margaret. "It's not a risk, it's the thing you take all the other risks for." He paused. "Everything else, all the hard things, all the frightening things, they're just the cost of getting here." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Then, did Clara teach you that?" "She showed me where to look," Ethan said. "I had to see it myself." He held his daughter, and the afternoon went on around the Whitmore farm, his farm, now, their farm, the land they had fought for and kept and would work for the rest of their lives. And the Wyoming sky did what it always did. Enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful, and inside the house there was a man who had ridden into this valley with nothing, and learned, late and hard and finally, that the only thing that had ever been missing from his life was his own willingness to receive what it was trying to give him. The cowboy, who was raised without love, had not been broken by the absence of it. He had been waiting, in his cold and careful way, for someone patient enough to show him it was real and stubborn enough to wait while he found his way to believing it. Clara had been that person, and he had been. It turned out he had always been exactly worth the waiting.